Welcome to Relationship Helpers. These are your hosts, Laura and Vincent Ketchy.
Hello, how are you doing?
Hi, so we have kind of entrenched ourselves now firmly into a series on anger in marriage. So this is our third installment.
Right, it's our third.
Yes. So today we're going to get into global labeling. So what's global labeling? I'm going to start with a few statements first, and that'll give you a window into what global labeling looks like. He's all about the sex. He's all about the money. She's a witch. She's so selfish. So these are common complaints that we hear as marriage counselors in our practice. But what do these statements accomplish?
They rouse anger. They cause the other person to get mad. Comments like these usually inspire defensiveness from the offended spouse, and a heated exchange escalates. That's when things get even more heated. It gets more volatile.
Right. So this labeling thing often is the precursor to just an explosion.
Right, it can. Most definitely.
Okay, so we're going to talk about global labeling. What is global labeling? They're harsh judgments that are extreme, and they create anger without regard to anything good.
Right, so let me repeat it again. So the global labeling, they are harsh judgments that are extreme, and they create anger without regard to anything good.
So basically, if somebody's using this kind of communication style, we'll call it, they're basically disregarding anything good about the other person. They are focusing squarely on something negative, whether perceived or true.
Right, yes. They're finding even that little small hint of negative, and they're exaggerating, or at least they're putting their whole focus on that negative characteristic or aspect in that other person.
So they could be zooming in on something.
Right.
And making it.
Yeah, maybe a little bit of truth in that other person. I mean, it could be a lot more truth in that person, but anyhow, they're making it even bigger than what it really is. It's not an overall view of the person.
Okay, and we'll get a little more in detail about that in a minute. But before we do, let's look at a few more examples of labeling, just to give folks a better idea of what labeling looks like. So it can take different forms. Some can be more obvious, like name calling,
right.
Something like calling somebody a jerk or stupid or witch or four-letter words or
other
expletives.
Or word that rhymes with witch.
Yeah.
Which may be used a lot.
We're keeping it PG here.
Right.
So, but labels can also not be so obvious. They can be a little more subtle.
Mm-hmm.
So telling someone that they're all about sex or all about money, that doesn't exactly translate into jerk or something like that. It doesn't carry necessarily the same punch.
Right. Well, it's not name calling as much, but it still is doing that labeling.
It sends a message. It does send a message. So regardless of whether the labeling spouse uses name calling or some of the examples we just used, it shows that they perceive things in extremes. And that's exactly what global labeling is all about. It's a kind of black and white thinking.
Right. So it's these people that do not see the overall. They just go all the way to one way, it's just this way, or all the way the other way, it's just this way. They don't see the gray in between. The person's they either eat too much or they eat too little. They don't see them eating healthy anyway in between, or a little bit on this side or a little bit on that side.
All right, so you may be curious, what causes someone to label? And we're going to discuss a few things today that causes people, or certain pathologies, so to speak, that causes people to use this kind of communication. So first we're going to take a look at depression. So depression, I think, can best be described as a great liar. It's riddled with unhelpful thinking habits. And global labeling is a hallmark of depression. Many times, global labeling is more subtle and self-inflicted when depression is involved.
Right.
Usually, depression involves an inner dialogue of untruths a person believes about themselves and the world around them. And an example would be, I'm never good enough, or everyone hates me.
Right, and so this is what the person is telling themselves, and they're not necessarily saying it out loud. Many times they're not saying it out loud, but they're using these put-downs, and that's how they're talking to themselves with this inner dialogue. They're saying things like, I'm stupid, I should have known better, I should have not made that mistake, how did I get myself in this situation? I'm just not smart. I'm ugly, or nobody likes me. I have a terrible personality. These are those inner dialogues that person may be having with themselves during this depression.
So I was just listening to the kind of barrage of negative statements you just made that a person could be feeling about themselves. And I just felt icky just hearing them. And I can only imagine what it's like to be in relationship with someone that's depressed. Because I would think that if this person is thinking all this about themselves, boy, it'd be really difficult to have healthy communication with that person.
Right. Well, it's hard to be around that other person. I mean, it's hard for it not to affect the other person that they're with.
Because they kind of put that out there.
Right.
Whether they verbalize this inner dialogue or not, it still impacts their countenance, and they're struggling with keeping it all together.
Right, it impacts how they relate to the other person, whether it's, as you said, whether it's body language, whether it's the actions they do, or whether it's the words that they say, or the things that they just don't do.
So depression has this way of making people become very self-focused. And it kind of makes them turn inward, too. So that, yet again, is another thing that impacts relationship.
Right.
It really does color a person's outlook. And because of this, being married to a depressed person may feel like, it may make you feel like it's hard to enjoy life together. Right.
Well, that person's constantly putting those thoughts in your mind, and you're having to fight them off. And if you don't fight them off, then you'll end up being depressed just like they are. If you start taking any of those, letting any of those thoughts go to fruit in your mind as well. So it's a constant battle with the person who's depressed, is fighting those, having a boundary with them there, or kind of keeping from falling into that same trap or down that same hole.
So it's really important that if you are in relationship with someone that is depressed, that you find some help for that situation and seek out some counsel, because it's a slippery slope.
Right, and they need some emotional support. They need support, and they need healthy coping mechanisms to work through that.
Right. They need some help, and you may as well, in learning
both.
how to cope with your spouse.
Right, both.
Okay, so we're going to move on to another cause, if you will, of global labeling, and this can be an offshoot of depression, and that is low self-esteem. We prefer the phrase low self-worth.
Right.
But low self-esteem, it and insecurity, they go hand in hand. A person could have quite a bit of bravado. They could be aggressive. But it's a mask for a sense of low self-worth.
Right, so sometimes it may be difficult to tell if someone has low self-worth. They may present on the outside as being very confident and, like Laura said, bigger than life, bravado, taking charge, being the center of attention, or always acting like they know, they're right. They're right. They're right. They're like constantly confident, coming across as being confident that they're right, and at times coming across as maybe a know-it-all or expert on that, when many times that's just a facade for them.
And then the other times, this person that's bigger than life, this aggressive person, could be using global labeling as a way to keep their spouse in their place.
Right, to keep kind of a distance with that person. And these are kind of their unhealthy coping mechanisms. They're putting up these walls to keep them for themselves in their own mind. And I'm not saying they're consciously doing this, but maybe subconsciously they're insecure and they only want to go so far in their relationship. They only want someone to know them so far. They're afraid if they know them any deeper, then they'll be rejected, or some kind of fear like that.
It puts them in the place of vulnerability.
Right, very vulnerable, yes.
Okay, so this person may call their spouse stupid or use some kind of other belittling insult.
Right, yeah, that you're just, how did I marry you? What, you're worthless. You can't even clean a house, or you can't even keep a job, or you can't even take care of the kids. I do all of this, and you were going to say something? Oh,
I was just going to say, I'm not trying to depart from what you're saying. I think it indirectly is related, but I think that our culture has a tendency to view self-esteem, or I should say low self-esteem, as like people that are kind of like the timid wallflower, when in reality, a lot of the people with low self-esteem are actually aggressive and bullies.
Right. Yeah, I think, as you said, our society, many times when they think of low self-esteem, they think of these passive people who don't speak up for themselves, and they do have low self-esteem,
right.
Most definitely. But they're also, on the other end, there's these people who may even seem narcissistic or whatever, that people will label them. They're over the top with that they're great, and that's what they're putting out for everybody. That I'm great, I have all the, I know everything, I know how to make all the right decisions, I'm successful, etc. I'm great, and they put up that wall.
All right, so a person with a sense of low self-worth can often be pretty focused on themselves. They don't take the time to find out or care why a person is behaving a certain way or another. It's easier for them to use this kind of black and white thinking, when the truth is that the other person is much more complicated.
Right. So let's go with this person. They're deciding to label their spouse stupid, ignorant, irresponsible, whatever that label is, when they're not really able to, and they go to these extremes of these labels, or they maybe say, oh, they're too sensitive. They're just a I don't know, scaredy cat, not scaredy cat, I don't know what. Anyway, they use these labels instead of really looking at, hey, why did I call her a witch? Is she really a witch? Is that really what she is? When deeper down, if they were actually to get to know her more or get to know him more, they may find out, and many times, and it is this case, that there's a lot more grace to it, meaning that, yes, they may come across as very negative or bad at sometimes. That's their bad side. They may get angry at that person. But on the other side, they're very tender in this area, and they may come across very soft and very gentle in another area. And when they keep going even deeper, they find that soft place, that tender space, is something where they really have a heart for other people. And maybe that's a place where they were abused as a child, or where they've had some type of trauma that happened in that area. And whenever you start touching that area in an aggressive, or even just not even aggressive, maybe assertive, or just whenever you get near maybe that area, they may come off as putting across these negative vibes, talking angry outburst, or whatever it may be, because they're getting triggered in that area.
And they're
not really a witch.
Right,
They're just getting triggered there, and they're coming across as that type of a person when they get triggered in that way.
So the person that's using the labeling really needs to learn how to kind of nurture.
Right. And also that person that's doing the labeling, again, they're focusing on themselves. They're trying to put this person in their place instead of actually looking at themselves and saying, hey, they're getting mad at me or they're doing this behavior, but it's not really about me. That behavior that they're doing, it's not about me. They're reacting to something in their past. They're getting upset by maybe my tone of voice. Or they're getting upset by maybe about something they saw on TV or something that somebody talked about there, and that triggered some thoughts in them, and that got them going down that road, which had nothing to do with me. Mm-hmm. But for that person who has this low self-worth and they may come across with this bravado, it's very difficult for them to slow down, get the focus off of themselves, because they're doing this whole bravado thing as a wall, a protective thing for themselves. But it's hard for them to get their focus off of themselves and actually look into the other person and see what's happening at a deeper level with that other person, which is really loving them.
So it really is. It's difficult for them to look outside of themselves and see that person may be hurting or is just using their behaviors as negative coping mechanisms.
Right, yeah. Just use a negative coping mechanism or walls to keep from getting hurt in that area again. They're just trying to protect themselves. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that they're consciously doing that. Many times it's subconsciously. They don't realize it.
Yeah, most people's behaviors aren't well thought out.
No, they're just reacting.
Yeah, they're just reacting. They're not intentionally living.
No.
Okay. So your question may be, okay, well, I've been guilty of using global labeling, or I know someone that uses global labeling. Well, what do we do about it? How do we overcome it?
Well, if you're asking me, I'll go with the first thing is going to be, and I say this to many of my couples, that's slowing down. Mm-hmm. One of my first things that I give for homework for my couples is, and you've probably heard this before, I don't know, some have heard it before. I've given this to my couples, but I also have done it in family settings where I've had the families use this as kind of like a family rule that they have. But it's for every one put down, the other person, whoever gave the put down, is to give that person 3 compliments. So what this means is, if, let's say the husband, if he felt like the wife said something to him that was a put down, what he would do is he would slow down right there and say, hey, listen, honey, I felt like what you said, and it could be tone, it could be the way they said it. It doesn't have to be content. Mm-hmm. But if he perceived that was a put down, he would say, hey, honey, I felt like that was a put down and how you said that. And then he would say, I need 3 compliments. Mm-hmm. So in that instance right there, it forces them to slow down in that conversation, and for the offending person, even though they may not have meant to offend or didn't mean for it to be a put down, maybe they didn't even realize it was a put down. I've got some that they don't even realize that the way they're saying it or what they say is a put down to the other person.
Some struggle with trying to see from another person's perspective.
Correct.
They do.
So this homework for every one put down, and the person who is put down as the judge of what felt like a put down to them. Mm-hmm. For every one put down, the other person gives 3 compliments, and that ends up really, if the couple does that, if the family does that, what happens is it really slows down this global labeling.
And I would imagine over time it would retrain their minds into really focusing on the better things about the people in their lives.
Yes, and just slowing down and thinking about how they're communicating with those people near them.
Okay. If you find yourself or if you find yourself insulting your spouse by name calling or maybe doing some of the more subtle things that we talked about earlier, it's going to be important that you become intentional about the way you interact with that person in the future. And really the only way to do that is you really have to have a repentant heart.
Right.
It's not enough to just say sorry and move on. An apology, it's not enough. A true apology is changed behavior. Mm-hmm. So the Bible says a few things about this. I think that a repentant heart would be reflective of having kind of a Colossians 3:7-8, those verses there in Colossians, mindset. You know, you used to do these things when your life was still part of the world, but now is the time to get rid of anger, rage, malicious behavior, slander, and dirty language, and then live out Ephesians 4, verses 29-31. Don't use foul or abusive language. Let everything you say be good and helpful, so that your words will be an encouragement to those who hear them. Do not bring sorrow to God's Holy Spirit by the way you live. Remember, He has identified you as His own, guaranteeing that you will be saved on the day of redemption. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, harsh words, and slander, as well as all types of evil behavior.
So in these, Paul is kind of reiterating to the Colossians, and he's also reiterating to the Ephesians of this. I put it as slowing down their behavior, looking at what they're doing, and actually ridding themselves of these negative behaviors or these negative habits. Because what happens is, it's like cursing. You can get into a habit of cursing, and people do that. They get in a habit of cursing, and they just end up using that for regular language when it's many times, most of the time, just not needed. It's not needed. Well, people do this with their family as well, or with their spouses. They may get in these habits of using these negative names or these global labels, and they get in the habit of it. And they just continue to call them these names, even when that person's not doing that, or when that person has worked on that. And let's say they are not, I don't know, eating too much. They're not overeating. If they were calling them fat, I don't know, or if they were calling them something like that, but they're actually doing well. But this person's got in the habit of calling them that, and they just continue calling them these names, these global labels.
Yeah, it seems like if we're not careful, our minds can operate on autopilot. It's really easy to get stuck in habits, negative habits.
Right.
Sometimes it requires being called out on it.
And that's what Paul is doing here to these different churches. He is calling them out about all this negative or this bad behavior, these bad habits. And specifically, he's talking about this bad language.
Yeah, it's like he's literally saying, put your finger on the reset button here.
Yeah, he's saying, stop cursing, stop putting people down. That's what he's telling them there. And that you're to live not as the world, the secular world here, but as God's chosen people, as God's redeemed.
Right, and as relationship helpers, it's important to us that we promote God-honoring marriages. And so, I'd encourage everybody to remember what it says in James chapter 1.
Okay, yeah, and I always like to mention this. Understand who James is. And I always ask my clients this. I say, who is James? Because I want them to know who is this person that's speaking, that wrote these. I want them to know who Paul is.
Who's the person behind this?
Right, I want them to know the power behind the words that are spoken here.
Right.
So James is Jesus' younger brother. So this is, however you want to say it, the half-brother of Jesus, because, God's his father, however you want to look at it. But this is James. James actually lived with Jesus, okay? He lived with him a long time. So James knows Jesus very, very well. And this is what, go ahead, Laura, this is what James says.
Well, James said, the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Let's build up our spouses using the principles behind things that we've read today from Paul's writings,
Right, yeah. So from Paul, let me go back to James. So okay. James there, he says the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. And before that, before those verses there, James is talking about speech, just like Paul. And he goes through a whole long passage where he's talking about speech and how he's talking about how the tongue is very important, which is exactly, and that words are very important, which this is exactly the opposite of, what's that one little proverb or thing you hear as a kid? Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. James and Paul say the exact opposite. That is not biblical law. It's
Right,
very
right.
unbiblical.
It's wrong.
Words are powerful. They're very powerful. The tongue is very powerful. And James, before he starts this verse here about the anger, he says to slow down. Slow down with what you say, with how you say it.
And listen.
Yeah, to listen. And going back to when you say it. But all of his whole message there is to slow down with what you say, reflect upon what you say. Mm-hmm. And at the end, he says the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Mm-hmm. He says, think about what you've said, what you've heard before you become angry.
Okay, so once you've slowed down and you've pressed the pause button, consider Colossians 4, verse 6, where it says, let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. So it's almost like, okay, so this is kind of a response to kind of with James saying slow to speak and slow to anger. This is kind of, okay, this is what we do next. Right,
yeah. This is Paul saying, now when you speak, be in step with the Spirit. He says that in Galatians, I believe. He says, be in step with the Spirit when you speak. Be in tune with God when you speak. Don't go off on your own and in your own understanding, but speak with graciousness that comes from God and understanding His relationship with you. Basically, we're getting back to...
I'd like to interject. Back to what you were saying about compliments just a little while ago. That, I think, is a good form of encouragement for your spouse, and it's a good way to kind of put into practice what we were just saying about that verse from Colossians. But it also gives you an opportunity to take a look at what you're grateful for in your spouse. Mm-hmm. And I think practicing speaking gratitude, it's really important to kind of let your spouse know what you appreciate. And so, encourage them. You're going to go a lot further with these marriage skills, if you want to call them that, than cutting someone down to put them in their place. Because at the end of the day, aren't we all lowly and in need of a Savior?
We are.
We all fall short of the glory.
We do, and we need to be instead of putting each other down, we need to be building each other up in our marriages and our relationships. So we encourage you to do that in your relationships, in your marriages, to let your spouse know what you appreciate about them. Let your spouse know what their strengths are in the marriage, and how they contribute to it, so that they understand their value. Not only, of course, they'll understand their value in the marriage, but going along with that, they'll begin to understand their value to God.
So I'm just reminded again of what you were saying about the compliments, and I think that you and I could actually just role play this right now.
Okay.
Not that either of us said anything in the midst of this podcast episode that was offensive or insulting to one another, but I just think that it could be an example.
Okay, so you wish to give me compliments.
I will. I think I'll give you 3. Okay. And I'm going to be very specific about things maybe you did today that I really appreciate. 1, I really appreciate how you took our son out on a walk this morning while he was fussy and in need of some distraction from his teething. And I know that could be tiresome in this hot summer weather, but I appreciate you doing that. Another thing that I appreciate about you is how you care for our family and how much effort you put into your work. And then lastly, I appreciate how you consider us in your timing and in your schedule.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Laura, I appreciate how you contribute to our podcast, how you really kind of help define and come up with a lot of the material here. I really appreciate you being able to have a lot of depth of insight into relationships and being able to share that with me and with everyone else. Of course, I appreciate how you're a good mother and how you take care of our little boy, and how you read to him. You take the time, as you've done today and as you did yesterday, to read some books to him and help him to sound out words, or at least know how they're supposed to be said, although he's, of course, not able to say them now. And I appreciate you for, of course, for your cooking. I know that's an easy one, but you're always good, even though I may complain at times when you try some recipes that are a little different. But I do appreciate the variety that you cook, and how well you cook, and how much energy that you put into it, and how good the meals are. Thank you.
I appreciate that, and I enjoyed doing this activity, and I hope that you guys have learned some tricks today for your little marriage skills bag.
Right, and thanks for listening to us, and we hope you have a great day. Goodbye.
Until later. Thank you for joining us today on Relationship Helpers. It is our hope that you gained some valuable information. For the show notes and more information on today's topic, please visit www.relationshiphelpers.net. Again, that is www.relationshiphelpers.net. If you enjoyed our show, please go to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and review. If you had questions or concerns about our show, please let us know about this as well by going to our website, www.relationshiphelpers.net. Thanks again, and have a blessed week. Note that accuracy and authority in regards to the subject matter covered today is not a replacement for professional care. Neither the host, the clinicians, or the guests are rendering clinical or other professional advice. Seek professional help if you need it.